Mara Whitlock pressed her baby against her chest so hard, the child whimpered, and she did not loosen her grip. Her father's boot had just kicked her satchel off his porch and into the February mud. Not her hands, her satchel. But the message landed the same. Get off my land, don't come back. Clara was 6 weeks old. The wind coming down off the ridge smelled like iron and ice. And Silas Whitlock turned his back and walked inside without a single word of goodbye. If you've ever been made to feel like your existence was someone else's inconvenience, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to its end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Mara Whitlock did next, what she built, what she survived, who she became deserves to be witnessed. The satchel landed in the mud with a sound like a closed door. Mara stood on the bottom step of the porch she had scrubbed every Saturday since she was 9 years old, the one she had repainted herself 2 summers back, when the gray started peeling, and she looked at that satchel in the mud, and she made herself breathe. In. Out. Clara stirred against her chest, the baby's face tucked into the wool of Mara's coat, her breath warm and small and impossibly trusting. Papa. Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt. It is February. Silas Whitlock had already turned toward the door. He stopped. He did not turn back around. I'm aware of the month. She's 6 weeks old. I'm aware of that too. Mara stepped down off the last step. Her boot sank into the mud and she felt the cold seep through the sole where the leather had started to crack. She had been meaning to get that fixed. She had been meaning to do a lot of things before her world came apart at the seams. Where am I supposed to go? Now he turned, and she wished he hadn't, because Silas Whitlock's face held no anger, no shame, just the flat, closed-off look of a man who had already finished a conversation in his own head and saw no reason to revisit it. The Henley place is empty, he said. Has been since October. You know where it is. That cabin doesn't have a full roof. Then you'd best get there before dark so you can see what you're working with. Mara felt something move through her that she could not name. It was not grief. Grief was soft grief, bent you. This was harder than that. This was the thing that lived underneath grief, the bedrock you hit, when everything else had been stripped away. Mama. She turned her eyes to the window. She could see her mother's silhouette behind the curtain, perfectly still, perfectly useless. Mama, are you going to say something? The curtain did not move. Mara picked up her satchel. She did not look at the window again. The road to the Henley cabin was 4 miles of frozen mud and broken rock, winding up the eastern face of the ridge, where the pines grew so close together. The snow collected in cathedral shelves along the branches, and dropped without warning when the wind shifted. Mara had made this walk 100 times as a girl chasing her brother Eli down to the creek bed where the trout ran thick in summer. She had never made it in February. She had never made it carrying 40 extra pounds and a newborn strapped to her chest with a length of wool flannel and a prayer. Clara slept through the first mile. Then she didn't. I know, Mara said, adjusting her hold, pressing her lips to the top of the baby's head. I know it's cold. I'm working on it. Clara's cry was thin and high. The cry of a creature not yet certain the world was safe, testing the air for a response. Mara gave her one. She kept talking low and steady, her voice a rope thrown into the dark. We're going to a cabin, she said. It needs some work, but we've done hard things before. You don't remember because you were very new, but labor was hard, and we got through that just fine. You came out hollering, and I hollered right back. We're good at getting through hard things, you and me. She didn't believe all of it, but she said it like she did, because that was the trick her grandmother had taught her. You say the thing you need to be true until your body forgets it isn't yet. The Henley cabin appeared at the top of the last rise the way bad news always does, earlier than expected and worse than described. Half the roof on the eastern side had caved under the weight of the previous winter's snow, leaving a gap where the sky showed through like a wound. The door hung at an angle on a broken hinge. The woodpile on the south side was down to a scatter of split logs not worth counting, and the window on the north face had been patched with oilskin that had since torn free on one side and now flapped in the wind with a sound like something trying to escape. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. "All right," she said to Clara. "All right." She went inside. The floor was swept at least, or had been once. Whatever the Henleys left behind was modest but real: a cast-iron stove with a hairline crack along the back plate, a narrow iron bed frame without a mattress, 3 hooks on the wall beside the door, a table with one leg shimmed up with a flat stone, and 2 chairs that looked like they'd lived hard lives but were still standing. A lantern on the windowsill. Half a box of matches beside it. Mara counted the matches. 14. She set her satchel on the table, kept Clara against her chest, and started with the stove. The crack in the back plate worried her. She'd seen cracked stoves throw sparks sideways in ways that started fires nobody wanted, but she had no other heat source, and the temperature was dropping fast. She checked the flue with her free hand, clear at least, and laid the fire small and careful, the way her grandmother had taught her. Small fires were safer. Small fires were also easier to feed. She lit it on the 3rd match and stood over it until she was certain it intended to stay lit. Then she sat down in the least broken of the 2 chairs, unbuttoned her coat, and nursed Clara in front of the weak orange glow of a fire in a cabin with half a roof in the first week of February, alone in the mountains outside a town that had already decided what she was. She thought about crying. She decided not to. Instead, she looked at Clara's face, the way the baby nursed, with her whole body engaged in the effort, small fists clenched, brow furrowed like the task required her complete concentration, and Mara felt something settle in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of a river. "Nobody handed us this," she said quietly. "That means nobody can take it away." Clara did not respond, being occupied, but she gripped Mara's finger in her fist, and Mara held on. The first week was about survival in its most primitive form: heat, water, food, sleep, none of them in sufficient quantity, all of them requiring constant effort to maintain. Mara worked the problem the way her father had once taught her to work a difficult horse. One thing at a time. No rushing, no looking too far ahead. "You look too far ahead with a difficult horse," he'd said, "and you spook yourself worse than the animal." She did not think about him when she thought about that lesson. She patched the window with a piece of canvas she found folded under the bed frame, nailing it into place with the heel of her boot and 4 bent nails she pulled from a crack in the wall. It wasn't airtight, but it was better. She dragged the broken chair outside and used it for firewood the first night when her supply ran low, feeding it piece by piece and feeling no particular sentiment about the sacrifice. She learned the rhythms of the cracked stove, how to bank the fire low enough to last through the night without pushing heat through the crack in a way that made her nervous, how to tell by sound whether the flue was drawing clean. She went out for wood every morning before full light, strapping Clara tight against her chest under the exterior layer of her coat, the baby's warmth as much for Mara as for her. The woodpile to the south of the cabin was nearly useless. What little remained was rotted through with moisture and crumbled when she split it. But there was deadfall in the tree line, 50 yards north, and she went for it with the hatchet she'd found hanging on a nail inside the door. Every trip she came back with as much as she could carry one-handed, the other arm a brace for Clara, and she stacked what she brought against the south wall under the overhang where it could dry. By the 4th day, she had established something that might charitably be called a system. By the 7th day, Clara got sick. It started as a cough. Small, almost delicate, the kind you could convince yourself meant nothing. Mara did not convince herself. She had helped nurse enough children through frontier winters to know what a cough in February could become if you did not take it seriously. She moved Clara closer to the stove. She sat up through the night with the baby against her chest, her back against the wall, one ear on the child's breathing and one eye on the fire. By the 2nd night of the cough, Clara had a fever. Mara pressed the back of her hand to the baby's forehead and felt the heat radiating like a coal, and something moved through her that was quieter and more terrible than fear. It was the particular calm of a person who has run out of options except the right one. She had been careful with her provisions. She had enough salt pork and dried beans to last another week if she was strict. But she had nothing medicinal, no willow bark, no camphor, nothing to bring the fever down. The nearest place to find any of it was Frost Hollow, 4 miles down the road. She'd come up the town where every woman who'd ever had occasion to feel superior to Mara Whitlock would now have permanent visible proof that they'd been right all along. She wrapped Clara in every piece of warm cloth she owned. She banked the fire as high as she dared with the cracked back plate. She put on her coat and her boots and went down the mountain in the dark. Frost Hollow, at 6 in the morning, was not entirely asleep, but it was not yet fully awake, a state that suited Mara well. She went straight to Dora Crane's place, not the general store, not the doctor's Dora Crane, who had been her mother's friend once before the territory's memory got too long and its forgiveness got too short. Dora was a practical woman who kept a kitchen garden and a shelf of dried herbs and was not given to gossip before breakfast. Mara knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened. Dora Crane was 60 years old and built like a fence post, narrow, upright, and with a face that had weathered a great deal without softening unduly. She looked at Mara the way you look at something you weren't expecting but recognize immediately. Mara Whitlock. Mrs. Crane, my daughter has a fever. I need willow bark if you have it. A silence stretched between them, not long, but present. You'd better come in. Mara went in. She did not say thank you, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she understood instinctively that gratitude would complicate this transaction in ways that didn't serve either of them. She stood in Dora Crane's kitchen while the older woman moved to her shelf, and she felt the heat of the wood stove in the room like a physical mercy, and she did not sit down and did not take off her coat. How long she been sick? Dora asked, not turning around. 2 days of cough. 1 day of fever. You been up at the Henley place? Yes. Dora turned with a cloth bundle in her hands. She held it out. Mara took it. That's willow bark and some dried chamomile. Steep it weak, not strong, she's small. I know. I know you know. Dora looked at her steadily. How are you fixed for food? I'm managed. That isn't what I asked. Mara met her eyes. I'm managed for another week. After that, I'll figure the next thing. Dora turned back to the shelf. She came back with a cloth sack, beans, cornmeal, a paper of salt. She set it on the table. I know you don't need it, Dora said crisply. Take it anyway. I have a surplus, and I dislike waste. Mara looked at the sack. She picked it up. Thank you, Mrs. Crane. Go home to your girl. She went. The walk back up the mountain was harder with the weight of the provisions, but she moved faster than she had, coming down urgency, burning in her legs. She was back at the cabin before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, her breath coming in white clouds, her feet soaked through the cracked boot again, and when she pushed the door open and heard Clara's thin wail from the pile of blankets by the stove, she crossed the room in 4 steps and had the baby in her arms before the door finished swinging. I'm here, she said. I've got it. I've got what you need. She steeped the willow bark weak the way Dora had said. She held Clara upright against her shoulder and coaxed the liquid in with a spoon drop by careful drop, the way you feed a flame when you can't afford to rush it and can't afford to fail. Clara fussed. Clara cried. Clara finally exhaustedly accepted. Mara sat in the chair by the stove with her daughter pressed to her chest and did not put her down again for the better part of 2 days. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Mara knew the moment it happened. She was half asleep in the chair, Clara's head under her chin, and she felt the baby's skin shift, the sick heat giving way to something cooler, more ordinary, the warmth of a living child instead of a burning one. She pressed her lips to Clara's forehead and sat very still for a long moment. Then she cried. Not the way she'd been afraid to cry before, not the helpless flooding kind, just the quiet private kind that doesn't ask anything from anyone and doesn't need to. Tears that ran down her face in the firelight while Clara slept against her shoulder, oblivious and warm and safe. Mara let them come and she let them go, and when she was done, she wiped her face on her sleeve and said to no one in particular, "All right, good, The days that followed were quieter than the ones before, and Mara noticed that quiet had a texture to it. It wasn't the absence of sound so much as the presence of steadiness. She began to establish not just systems, but rhythms. The fire tended at dawn and dusk. Wood gathered mid-morning when the light was best. Clara nursed on a schedule that the baby had invented herself, and that Mara had learned to read without language. Meals simple and regular. Sleep taken in pieces fitted around the baby's needs, less exhausting now that the crisis had passed. She began to notice things she hadn't had room to notice before. The way the light came through the patched window at midday, pale and clean and almost kind. The sound of the pines when the wind moved through them, not threatening anymore, but simply present a sound the mountains had made long before she arrived, and would make long after she was gone. The way Clara looked at her with those unfocused newborn eyes that were nevertheless entirely focused on her, as if she was the only landmark worth orienting toward. Mara Whitlock had never thought of herself as a remarkable woman. She had thought of herself as competent, as steady, as the kind of woman who got things done without being asked twice and without expecting praise. She had thought of herself privately as someone who would have made a good wife and a good mother and a good partner on a working ranch if the right circumstances had come together in the right order. Instead, the circumstances had come together in the wrong order, and she had been handed a half-roofed cabin in February and told to disappear. She had not disappeared. She thought about that while she split wood one morning, Clara asleep in the nest of blankets just inside the door where Mara could see her through the open gap. The hatchet was old, and the handle had a slight crack she'd reinforced with a strip of leather cord she'd salvaged from her satchel. It worked. She swung it, and the wood split, and she stacked the pieces against the wall and swung again. She had not disappeared. She was still here 4 weeks into a winter that had killed more prepared people than her in years less severe than this one. She was still here, and Clara was still here, and the fire in the cracked stove was still burning, and she had food enough for another 10 days, and the roof, the whole roof, both halves, was still standing, because she had gotten up on it herself 3 days ago with a bucket of pine tar and a piece of salvaged board and made it so. She had done all of it herself. Nobody had helped her. Nobody had come. She did not yet know that was about to change. She was stacking the last of the morning's wood when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She heard them before she saw anything. The particular rhythm of a horse moving with purpose, not wandering, and she straightened and looked toward the tree line, where the road curved in from the south. She had heard hoofbeats on that road exactly once since she'd arrived, a rider passing at a distance who had not stopped and whom she had not hailed. This rider stopped. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing. A man on a gray horse, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheepskin coat and a hat that had seen better weather. He sat still for a moment, the way experienced riders do, reading the situation before he entered it. Then he stepped down from the saddle and looped his reins over the low branch of the nearest pine, and he walked across the clearing toward her. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired under the battered hat, a face that had spent years outdoors and showed it not unpleasant, just permanent, carved in by weather and work, into something that was honest even before he opened his mouth. He stopped 10 feet from her. "Ma'am?" He touched the brim of his hat. "This is private property," Mara said. "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware. I was acquainted with Hap Henley before he passed." He paused. "Name's Ronan Mercer. I run the Black Ridge Ranch south side of the ridge. I've been seeing smoke from your chimney for the better part of 3 weeks, and I kept meaning to come check on it." "I don't need checking on." He did not flinch from that. He simply looked at her, at the hatchet in her hand, at the wood stacked against the wall, at the cabin behind her, with its patched window and its pine-tarred roof, and she had the uncomfortable sense of being assessed by someone who was neither judging nor dismissing her. "No, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." A silence. "Then why are you here, Mr. Mercer?" He reached back toward where he'd tied his horse. There was a bundle strapped behind the saddle. She hadn't noticed it before. He untied it and set it on the ground between them. Timber planking, fresh cut, the yellow smell of new pine coming off it even in the cold. "I've got a mill on my property," he said. "These were left over from repairs I made in October. I thought they might be of more use up here than sitting in my barn. Your east side is holding, but if you get another heavy snow, the gap in the rafters is going to give you trouble." Mara looked at the timber. She looked at him. "That's a 4-mile ride," she said. "Yes, ma'am. In February. I've ridden in worse months." He paused. "I heard about your situation, Miss Whitlock. I don't know all of it, and I don't need to. What I know is that the Henley place has been sitting empty, and you're in it with a child, and you've been keeping that stove lit for 3 weeks without asking anything from anyone." Mara's grip on the hatchet handle tightened slightly. "I don't need charity, Mr. Mercer." "No," he said again in that same even way that wasn't agreement so much as acknowledgement. "I reckon you don't. This isn't charity. This is timber that needed a use and a neighbor who needed timber." He bent and picked up the bundle. "Where do you want it?" Mara Whitlock stood in the clearing outside the half-roofed Henley cabin on a February morning with a hatchet in her hand and a baby asleep inside, and looked at this man who had ridden 4 miles in the cold to bring her lumber, and she made the calculation that competent women always have to make between what they needed and what it might cost to accept it. "Stack it against the south wall," she said. "Out of the wet." Ronan Mercer nodded. He carried the timber to the south wall and stacked it neatly with the efficiency of a man accustomed to working without being watched. He did not ask to come inside. He did not linger. When the timber was stacked, he came back to where she stood, picked up the hatchet she'd set down on the chopping block, split 3 pieces of the new wood without being asked. Clean practice strokes and set them on the stack. "I'll be back next week," he said, "if that's agreeable." "You don't need to." "No, ma'am." He picked up his horse's reins. "I reckon I don't." He rode back down the road, the way he'd come. Mara stood in the clearing for a long moment after he disappeared into the tree line. The cold pressed in around her, familiar, now almost companionable. From inside the cabin, she could hear Clara beginning to stir the small searching sounds that preceded the more emphatic ones. She picked up the new timber and carried it inside. She would use it. She would not think too much about where it came from. But she thought about his hands, the way they'd moved on the hatchet, certain and unhurried, and she thought about the fact that he had not looked at her with pity, had not looked at her with judgment, had not looked at her with the particular expression that people had been using on her for months now, the one that said, "I see what you've done, and I am measuring you by it." He had looked at her like a person. She had not realized until this moment how much she had been missing that. Clara's sounds from inside the cabin escalated from searching to demanding. "I'm coming," Mara said. "I hear you." She went inside to her daughter, to her fire, to the life she was building with her own 2 hands in a cabin that had no business being habitable, but was because she had made it so. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and indifferent, covering the clearing, covering the tracks of a gray horse heading south, and Mara Whitlock did not look out the window because she had work to do, and she had always done her work. Ronan Mercer came back the following Tuesday, the way he said he would. He brought timber, again shorter cuts. This time, the kind suited for patching interior gaps, and a canvas sack that clinked when he set it down on the chopping block. Mara was at the woodpile when he rode in, and she did not stop what she was doing. She let him tie his horse, let him carry the timber to the south wall, and then she looked at the sack. "What's in it?" "Nails," he said. "And a proper hammer. The kind that doesn't leave half the nail bent sideways." She had been using the heel of her boot. She had not mentioned that to anyone. She looked at him. "You been watching me work?" "No, ma'am. I saw the roof patch when I came through the clearing. Pine tar and a piece of board. Good thinking. But the nails on the south edge are sitting at angles that won't hold a second winter." Mara set down her hatchet. She picked up the sack. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. I had the nails." "Mr. Mercer?" "Miss Whitlock." They looked at each other across the chopping block, and it was the kind of look that 2 stubborn, capable people exchange when they are trying to work out the terms of something that doesn't have a name yet. "I don't run a charity," she said. "Neither do I." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out. "I've got 60 head of cattle that need to be inventoried before spring." My last hand who kept the ledger quit in December, and my own handwriting is a disgrace. Word in town is you kept your father's accounts from the time you were 15. Mara took the paper. It was a rough count numbers in a hand that was not quite a disgrace, but was certainly ambitious in its inconsistency. Word in town? She repeated. Dora Crane mentioned it. Dora Crane talks too much. She talks accurately, he said. There's a difference. Mara looked at the numbers on the paper. She looked at the nails in the sack. She did the calculation again, the same one she'd been making every time he appeared in her clearing, and she arrived at the same conclusion she always did, which was that the numbers were honest, and the need was real, and that pride was a fine thing to have until it got your child killed. I'll do your ledger, she said. When Clara settled in the afternoons, you can bring the records here. He nodded. No triumph in it. No relief. Just the nod of a man who had made a fair offer and received a fair answer. I'll bring them Thursday, he said. He left without asking to come inside. She noticed that every time the way he never pushed past the boundary of the clearing, never assumed more than she offered. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. Thursday, he brought the ledgers. They were a disaster. 3 years of cattle records, kept by 4 different hands, none of whom agreed on a system, 2 of whom had apparently been inventing numbers wholesale toward the end of their tenure. Mara sat at the table with Clara in the sling across her chest, and went through the first ledger page by page, while Ronan sat in the second chair, the surviving one, the less broken one, which she gave to him without comment, and drank the coffee she had made from the last of her supply. This column, she said, tapping a figure. What does this represent? I believe that's winter feed cost. You believe? The man who wrote it is in Nevada. Of course he is. She turned the page. And this column's been erased and rewritten. That would be the previous man. He had a creative relationship with addition. He had a creative relationship with the truth. She looked up. Mr. Mercer, do you know what you actually have out there? Cattle. Approximately 60, you said? Approximately. That is not how accounting works. That, he said with no discernible shame, is why I needed someone who knows how accounting works. Clara made a sound, the small, satisfied sound she made when she was full and warm, and had decided the world was acceptable. Mara adjusted the sling automatically, not breaking her focus on the ledger. I can reconstruct this, she said. It'll take a proper count to start fresh. You'd need to ride the herd. I can do that. And I'll need all of it. Feed receipts, sale records, whatever bills of sale you have. Don't bring me half. Yes, ma'am. And stop saying yes, ma'am like that. He looked at her. Like what? Like you're agreeing with someone difficult. A pause. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. I'll bring everything Friday, he said. He came Friday with a crate of papers that were if anything worse than the ledgers. But he also came with a side of salt pork wrapped in cloth, which he set on the table without ceremony and without explanation. Mr. Mercer, from my smokehouse, I have more than I can use before spring. That is the 3rd time you've brought me something I didn't ask for. And the 3rd time you've accepted it, he said without inflection. She had no answer for that. She took the salt pork. She started on the crate. It became a pattern. Tuesdays he brought supplies. Never extravagant, always useful, always framed as surplus. He couldn't use rather than charity he was offering. Thursdays, he brought ledger questions, which were getting less frequent as the accounts began to take shape under Mara's hands. Fridays, sometimes, he simply appeared in the clearing and split wood for an hour while she worked inside, and then left without coming in. She started leaving the door slightly open on Fridays. She told herself it was for the air. Clara was 3 months old now and had developed opinions about everything. She had opinions about the light. She preferred the late afternoon angle that came through the repaired window. She had opinions about sound. She liked the rhythm of wood being split, which Mara found inconvenient and useful in equal measure. She had opinions about Ronan Mercer specifically, which she expressed by going entirely quiet and watchful whenever he was in the room, in the way of very young creatures who are deciding whether a large unfamiliar thing is a threat or a fixture. The first time she reached for his finger, Mara was across the room and didn't see it happen. She heard Ronan go quiet, a different quiet than his usual quiet. Something arrested about it, and she looked up. Clara had his finger in her fist. She was looking up at him with the absolute focus of a 3-month-old conducting a serious evaluation. Ronan Mercer sat very still and let her hold it. "She does that," Mara said. "Don't read too much into it." "No, ma'am. She grabbed the corner of a ledger last week and wouldn't let go for 20 minutes. "Smart girl," he said. "Knows what's important." Mara turned back to her work. But something in her chest had shifted quietly in a way she didn't examine too carefully. The first crack came on a Sunday in late March. She had not been expecting it, which was how it always came. The thing you weren't watching for, arriving on the day you'd let your guard down a degree. She was at the creek 200 yards from the cabin, filling the water pail Clara bundled and strapped to her chest, when she heard voices from the road. She did not move. She listened. 2 riders. She could tell from the cadence of hooves 2 horses moving slow, not passing through, but looking for something. She stayed still in the trees beside the creek. Said she was up the Henley Road. "Silas wants us to bring the girl back. Silas wants to know if there's a man up there with her. Says if Mercer's been helping her, that's his business needing minding." A pause. The horses moved. She could not see them through the tree line, but she could hear them clearly. "Mercer's business is his own. Not when it touches Whitlock land, it ain't. You know what Silas said. He wants to know what she's built up here, whether it's anything worth accounting for." The horses moved on down the road. Mara stood at the creek for a long moment after the sound faded. Her father hadn't forgotten about her. He'd sent men to count what she'd accumulated. Something cold settled in her stomach, colder than the creek water, colder than February. She picked up the pail and walked back to the cabin, and did not run, because running was for people who had something to fear, and she was deciding very deliberately that she was not that. She told Ronan on Thursday. She laid it out plainly, the way she did everything, no drama, no editorializing, just the facts as she had heard them. 2 men. The conversation. Her father's name. Ronan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you think he wants?" he asked. "I think he wants to know whether I've become valuable to someone. If I have, that makes me an asset. My father understands assets. And if you haven't, then I remain a consequence." She said it without bitterness, which was harder than saying it with bitterness would have been. That's his word, not mine. Ronan set down his coffee. He looked at the table for a moment. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plain." "Go ahead. What you've done here, the roof, the accounts, the winter, you've kept yourself and that child alive through, that is not consequence. That is not scandal. That is not anything your father gets to define." He paused. "And if he sends men to count what you've built, then they're going to have to count a great deal. Because you have built a great deal." Mara looked at him. She felt something sting behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It's an accurate thing to say," he replied. "There's a difference." She recognized her own words coming back to her, and she looked down at the ledger to give herself somewhere to put her face. "The east pasture count is off by 3 head, she said. "You're going to want to check the fence line at the north corner before the spring mud sets in." "Yes, ma'am." "And stop?" "Agreeing with someone difficult," he said. "Yes." This time she heard it clearly, the thing adjacent to a smile becoming briefly the actual thing. She did not look up from the ledger, but her mouth did something she hadn't given it permission to do. April arrived like a negotiation. Some days warm, some days a hard freeze that undid whatever the thaw had started. But the mud came, which meant the worst of the winter was finished, and with the mud came the slow return of color to the world. The gray-brown ridge going green at the edges, the creek running fast and loud with snowmelt, the first tentative birdsong from the pines, Mara expanded her range. She planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing strip beside the cabin, working it in the early mornings, before the day got complicated. She bartered ledger work with Dora Crane for seed, and with the blacksmith's wife for 2 laying hens, which she housed in a crate she built herself from the last of the salvaged lumber. The hens had opinions about their accommodation that rivaled Clara's opinions about everything, but they laid, and eggs were eggs, and Mara thanked them for their service without warmth and with genuine gratitude. She was outside with the hens when the rider came fast down the road from the south. Not the measured approach of Ronan's gray horse, but the urgent gait of someone covering ground they needed to cover quickly. She stood up straight, Clara on her hip, and watched the rider resolve from a shape into a person. It was one of Ronan's hands. Young freckled, she'd seen him twice before at the edge of the property. He pulled up hard in the clearing. "Miss Whitlock, Mr. Mercer sent me." He was breathing like he'd been riding hard for longer than 4 miles. "There's trouble at Black Ridge. He needs—" He stopped. He looked uncertain suddenly, as if he'd only just registered that he was asking a woman with a baby on her hip. "What kind of trouble?" Mara said. "Men came in last night, 3 of them, cut the fence on the east quarter, and moved a dozen head before we spotted them. We pushed them off, but they said—" He stopped again. "What did they say?" "They said they'd be back. Said the Black Ridge title wasn't clean, and Mr. Mercer knew it." The hand looked at her steadily. "Mr. Mercer wants to know if you'd look at some papers." Mara was already moving toward the cabin door. "Tell him I'll be there within the hour," she said. She was there in 40 minutes. Black Ridge was larger than she'd pictured from the ledgers, a working ranch with a proper house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, and a network of fencing that spread across the south face of the ridge in a geometry that told you at a glance that someone had thought carefully about it. The hands watched her arrive with expressions that ranged from curious to carefully neutral. She tied her horse at the post and carried Clara inside without waiting to be invited, because Ronan was on the porch and he held the door open when he saw her coming. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Show me the papers." They were on the table, a stack of documents, some official, some handwritten, the kind of accumulated record that a piece of land accrues over 20 years of ownership and sale and dispute. Mara sat down and went through them with Clara balanced on her knee and her full attention on the pages. 40 minutes later, she found it. "Here," she said. She put her finger on a line in a deed transfer dated 11 years back. "This conveyance, the legal description of the eastern boundary. You see this reference, the creek survey marker?" Ronan leaned over her shoulder to look. He was close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air. "I see it. This marker was moved. I can't prove it from these papers, but I know how land fraud works. My grandfather lost 40 acres to it when I was a girl. This description doesn't match the survey notes from the original patent. You've got 2 conflicting boundary descriptions, and someone is counting on you not knowing which one is legal." He was quiet for a moment. "Can you document it? I can write out exactly what the discrepancy is and where it sits in the record. Whether it holds up in front of a judge depends on whether you can get a land agent out here to do a proper resurvey." She looked up at him. "But if someone's coming at your fences and claiming your title isn't clean, they've seen these same papers. They know about the discrepancy. They're going to use it before you can. How long do I have? If they filed anything already, not long. If they're still just threatening—" She paused, looking at the date stamps on the documents. "You need to be in front of a judge before they are." Ronan straightened. He looked at her, a look she was getting to know, the one where he was seeing something he hadn't expected, even though by now he should have stopped being surprised. "I need to ride to the county seat," he said. "Tomorrow." "Then go tomorrow. I need someone to have these papers in order before I go. Tonight." Mara looked at the stack. She looked at Clara. She looked at the fading afternoon light. "I'll need more lamp oil," she said. He had it. She worked at the Black Ridge table until past 10 that night, Clara sleeping in a blanket nest near the stove, the ranch hands moving quietly around the edges of the house with the careful consideration of men who understood that something important was happening, and that the most useful thing they could do was stay out of the way. Ronan sat across from her and answered every question she asked him, and fetched lamp oil when it ran low, and at some point put a plate of food at her elbow without commentary, which she ate without looking away from the pages. At 10 past 10 she set down the pen. "That's everything I can build from what you have," she said. "The discrepancy is documented on page 4. The conflicting survey descriptions are cross-referenced in the margin notes. If the land agent does a resurvey, and it supports what I've shown here, you have a strong case." Ronan picked up the document. He read through it slowly, and she watched him read, watched his face process the information, the particular quality of attention a man gives a document that might save everything he's built. He set it down. "Mara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not Miss Whitlock. Mara. She felt it land the way a stone lands in still water the moment of contact, and then the rings moving outward. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "Tonight, with her here." He looked at Clara, small and oblivious in her blanket nest. "You didn't have to come at all. You needed someone to read the papers," she said. "I read papers." "That isn't—" He stopped. "There are people in Frost Hollow who wouldn't have come. People who've known me 20 years. "Then they weren't paying attention to the problem," she said. "Which is a failure of character and arithmetic both." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll leave at first light," he said. "I should be back in 3 days. I'll keep the accounts current while you're gone. Tell your man where to leave the weekly numbers." He nodded. Then quietly he said, "Are you going to be all right up at the Henley place while I'm away?" Mara stood up and began gathering her things. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I was all right at the Henley place before you ever came through my clearing. I expect I'll manage 3 more days." She picked up Clara, who stirred and settled without fully waking. "But I appreciate you asking," she added, and she meant it, and she let him hear that she meant it, because he had earned that much. She rode back up the ridge in the dark, her daughter warm against her chest. The paper she'd spent 6 hours untangling, sitting in Ronan Mercer's hands, and the stars above the ridge so sharp and bright and cold that they seemed less like sky and more like something that had been promised. She did not think about the way he'd said her name. She did not think about it at all. She thought about it the entire way home. Ronan came back from the county seat on the 3rd day, the way he said he would. Mara heard his horse on the road before she saw him. That familiar rhythm she had learned without meaning to, the particular cadence of the gray horse moving with purpose. She was at the table working through the weekly feed tallies his hand had left that morning, Clara asleep in the sling across her chest, and she did not get up. She let him knock. She let him come in when she called. He looked like 3 days of hard riding. Coat, dusty jaw unshaved, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes rather than in the body. But he was carrying something not in his hands, in his face. The particular look of a man who went to fight and came back having won. "Well," she said. "Land agent's been appointed, resurvey ordered for the 1st week of May." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "Judge reviewed the discrepancy you documented. He agreed the conflicting descriptions constituted grounds for a formal review. Did you file first?" "By about 6 hours. He looked at her. "They had a man in the clerk's office. We passed each other in the hallway." 6 hours. Mara set down her pen. "Do you know who they are?" she said. "I have a name now. Carver. Denton Carver. He's been buying up disputed land claims across 3 counties for the past 4 years, gets in before the owners know there's a dispute, files a competing claim, pressures the settlement. Most ranchers don't have the records to fight it. Most ranchers can't read a deed transfer well enough to know what they signed." "But you had the records," Mara said. "I had someone who could read them," he said. She looked back at the feed tallies. She could feel him watching her with that steady quality of attention that she was trying very hard not to get accustomed to. "Carver's going to know it was you who found it," she said. "He's going to know someone at Black Ridge went through those papers carefully enough to catch what he planted." "I expect so. That's going to make him careful, or it's going to make him angry. Those are the 2 things men like that do when their plans get complicated." She looked up. "Which kind is he?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "The angry kind," he said. The resurvey was set for the first week of May, and the fence cutting started again the last week of April. 3 times in 7 days, different sections each time, never the same fence, twice methodical in a way that was designed to communicate something. Not theft, not yet. A demonstration. A message delivered slowly and at great expense, so the recipient understood the sender had patience and resources both. Mara heard about each incident through Ronan's hand, who had taken to stopping at the Henley place on his way back from the damage each morning to leave her the count. She kept a record. Every incident dated with the section of fence, the estimated number of hours of repair required the pattern of escalation. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it, but she had learned from her grandfather's land dispute that documentation was the only weapon that mattered in a courtroom, and that you built it before you needed it, not after. On the 4th morning the hand didn't come. Mara waited until mid-morning. Then she strapped Clara to her chest, saddled the horse she'd borrowed from Ronan 2 weeks ago and hadn't returned because neither of them had addressed the subject, and rode to Black Ridge. She heard the argument before she reached the barn. Ronan's voice flat and controlled in the way of a man keeping his temper by main force. Another voice she didn't recognize, louder, deliberate, performing confidence for an audience. She dismounted and walked toward the sound. There were 4 men in the yard. Ronan, his foreman, a weathered man named Holt she'd met twice, and 2 men she hadn't seen before. The strangers were dressed well enough to signal they weren't working men, but not so well that they'd look out of place on a ranch. They had the precise appearance of men who had practiced looking like whatever the situation required. The louder one was speaking when she came around the corner. "Understand the position, Mr. Mercer. We're not here to cause trouble. Mr. Carver simply wants to make clear that the resurvey may not resolve things the way you're anticipating. The boundary in question has been operating as documented for 11 years. Courts are reluctant to disturb established usage. The established usage," Ronan said, "is built on a fraudulent survey marker." That's a strong word. It's an accurate word. The louder man smiled. He had the smile of someone who had learned to use it as a tool. "Mr. Mercer, litigation is expensive, time-consuming. Your hands are occupied with fence repairs already." He stopped when he saw Mara. His smile adjusted slightly, became something else. "I wasn't aware you had company." "Miss Whitlock manages my accounts," Ronan said. His voice hadn't changed, but something in his posture had a slight shift, barely perceptible, that put him between the strangers and where she stood. "Does she?" The man looked at Mara with the particular quality of attention that men like him used to measure things they were considering using. "Interesting arrangement." "What I find interesting," Mara said before Ronan could speak, "is that you're describing 11 years of established usage without mentioning that the survey marker the usage is based on appears in no county record prior to 12 years ago. Which means it was placed after the original patent. Which means whoever placed it had a plan that predates Mr. Carver's current interest in this property by at least a year." The yard went quiet. The louder man looked at her. The smile was gone now. "That's a significant claim," he said carefully. "It's a documented one," she said, "which I suspect you know since Mr. Carver sent you here today instead of waiting for the resurvey. Men who are confident in their position don't send representatives to negotiate 4 days before a court-ordered review." Ronan said nothing. She could feel him not saying anything in a way that was its own kind of statement. The second man, the quieter one, who had not spoken yet, looked at his partner. Something passed between them. "We'll relay your position to Mr. Carver," the louder one said. He had recovered the smile, but it didn't reach anything now. "You can relay," Mara said, "that the position is already in front of a judge." They left. Holt watched them go with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has seen trouble in many forms and is classifying this particular variety. "Well," he said to no one specific. Ronan turned to look at Mara. She was adjusting Clara in the sling, the baby having woken during the confrontation, and was now extremely interested in the departing horses. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was already here." "Mara." They were fishing, she said. They wanted to know how much you knew, how much could be documented, and whether you had the spine to take it to a judge if they pushed. I answered all 3 questions. You answered them very clearly. Was I wrong? He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You were not wrong. Then stop looking at me like I did something surprising. He almost smiled. I'm not sure I can promise that. She handed him the morning's feed tallies, which she'd brought without being asked. The east pasture count is still short, she said. Check the fence at the creek crossing before the resurvey team comes through. I don't want them documenting a gap that makes our numbers look inconsistent. She rode back to the Henley cabin before noon. She spent the ride home thinking about what the quieter man's face had done when she mentioned the survey marker, the very slight tightening around the eyes that said she knows more than she should. She thought about what Ronan had said. The angry kind. Carver was going to escalate. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming. Not see it yet, just feel the pressure changing. She was right. The escalation came on a Tuesday, and it did not come at Black Ridge. It came at the Henley cabin. She was at the creek when she heard horses. Not one this time, not 2, but enough that the sound of hooves was layered and dense in a way that made Clara lift her head from the sling with the animal alertness of a creature that understood threat even at 5 months old. Mara picked up the water pail and walked back toward the cabin without hurrying, because hurrying was a signal and she was not ready to send one. There were 3 riders in the clearing. She recognized one of them. One of the men her father had sent in March, the one who'd done the talking at the road. He looked different on her ground than he had on the road. Smaller somehow. More aware of himself. The other 2 she didn't know. But she knew the type. She'd known it in her father's yard, and in the county clerk's office, and in every room where men with money employed men without scruple to make their problems someone else's problem. Miss Whitlock. The one she recognized touched his hat. Sorry to disturb you. You're not sorry, she said pleasantly, setting the water pail down. But go ahead. A pause. He hadn't expected that. We've been asked to deliver a message from your father. My father sent 3 men to deliver a message to one woman with a baby. She looked at each of them in turn. That seems like a great deal of horse for the job. The man shifted. Mr. Whitlock wants to know your intentions regarding the Mercer property. There's some concern that your involvement in his affairs may create complications. For whom? For the family. I'm not your family's concern anymore, she said. Your employer made that clear in February, in the mud, in front of my 6-week-old daughter. Miss Whitlock, what my father actually wants to know, she said, keeping her voice absolutely even, is whether Ronan Mercer's land is going to be worth something when this dispute is settled, and whether my involvement in it has put me in a position to benefit from that. And he wants to know whether he should be trying to get a piece of that, or trying to use me to get closer to it. She looked at the first man. Tell me if I'm wrong. The man said nothing. That's what I thought. She picked up the water pail. You can tell Silas Whitlock that the Mercer title is going to be clean by June, that my work at Black Ridge is contracted and compensated, and that my arrangements are my own business, which is a lesson I learned from watching him arrange everyone else's business without their consent. She looked at the other 2 men. I don't know who you work for, but if it's Denton Carver, you can tell him the same thing I told his men last Tuesday. The documents are in front of a judge. That doesn't change based on who rides into my clearing. She went inside and closed the door. She stood on the other side of it, with her back against the wood, and her heart going faster than she would have liked. Clara pressed to her chest and making the small questioning sound she made when she sensed something was off. We're fine, Mara said quietly. We're completely fine. She waited until she heard the horses leave. Then she sat down at the table and wrote out everything the riders, the message, the names she knew, and the descriptions of the ones she didn't, the exact words used, and her exact responses. She wrote it all in the clear, precise hand she'd developed keeping her father's accounts, the hand that left no room for misreading. She was going to need witnesses who weren't Ronan Mercer. She thought about Dora Crane. She rode to Frost Hollow the next morning. Dora Crane listened to the whole account without interrupting, which Mara had come to understand was how the woman operated. She absorbed everything before she responded to anything, which made her responses more useful than most people's. When Mara finished, Dora poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. "Carver," she said. "I know that name. He tried the same thing with the Alderman place 2 years ago. Got about halfway through before Walt Alderman's daughter figured out what was happening." She looked at Mara. "Walt's daughter is married to the county recorder now." Mara set down her cup. "Can you get me an introduction? I can do better than that." Dora stood up. "I can take you there this afternoon. Helen Alderman Pross has been waiting 2 years for someone to put the name Carver in front of a judge. She's going to want to know everything you have." Helen Alderman Pross was 30 years old precise and had a memory for documents that matched Mara's own in its completeness and depth. She sat across from Mara at the county recorder's desk, her husband's desk he having stepped discreetly out, and went through the documentation Mara had brought page by page. She turned to the survey discrepancy. She looked up. "I've seen this notation before," she said. "The way the boundary is described. This phrasing right here, I've seen it in 2 other Carver filings." Mara felt something sharpen in her chest. "In the other counties?" she asked. "In this county. 2 years ago, before the Alderman claim was dropped." Helen stood up and went to the filing cabinet behind the desk. She came back with a folder. She opened it on the desk between them. The phrasing was identical. Not similar. Identical. The same language used to describe a boundary that didn't match the original patent survey in a way that was designed to look like a clerical variation rather than a deliberate alteration. "He has a template," Mara said. "He has a method," Helen said. "And if we can document that this is the same method used across multiple filings, that's not a land dispute anymore." "That's fraud," Mara said. "That's fraud," Helen confirmed. "And fraud is a matter for the territorial court, not the county land office." They looked at each other across the desk. "I need copies of everything from the Alderman filing," Mara said. "I'll have them ready by Friday." Mara rode back to Black Ridge. Ronan was at the south fence with Holt when she arrived. She could see them from the rise working the repair on the latest cut section, the 2 of them moving with the efficient economy of men who have done a job together enough times to need no words for it. She did not interrupt the work. She tied her horse and went inside and laid out what she had on his kitchen table. Her documentation, the pattern she'd identified, the Alderman files she'd copied by hand at Helen's desk while Clara slept in Dora's arms in the corridor. When Ronan came in, she was still at the table. He looked at the spread of papers. "What is this?" he said. "This is how Denton Carver has taken 11 pieces of land across this territory in 4 years, she said. "Same method, same language, different counties, different judges, different ranchers who didn't know what they were looking at." She tapped the center document. "This is what takes it out of the land office and puts it in front of the territorial court." Ronan pulled out a chair. He sat down and looked at it, all of it, the whole architecture of what she'd built in 1 day's writing and 2 hours at a desk. He was quiet for a long time. "When did you do all of this?" he said finally. "Yesterday and today." "You went to Frost Hollow." "I went to Frost Hollow. I talked to Dora Crane. I talked to the county recorder's wife. I rode home, I wrote it up, and I brought it to you." She looked at him steadily. "Your resurvey is in 4 days. If we're going to file with the territorial court, it needs to happen simultaneously, so neither case can be used to delay the other." He looked at her, not at the papers, at her. "Mara," he said, "don't." "I haven't said anything." "You were going to say something that sounds like gratitude, but is shaped like surprise," she said. "And I don't need either one. I need you to look at what I've built here and tell me whether you're ready to take it to the territorial court, because if you're not ready, I need to know now so I can figure out who else is." A long silence. Then Ronan Mercer leaned forward, put both elbows on the table, and looked at the papers with the full, undivided attention of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him is more solid than he thought. "Tell me what we file first," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the south pasture, one of the horses called out and was answered. Clara slept in her nest of blankets by the stove, entirely unconcerned with land fraud or territorial courts or the particular quality of the silence that lived between two people who were building something and had not yet decided what to call it. Mara picked up her pen. "We start with the survey discrepancy," she said. "Then we attach the Alderman cross-reference. Then we file for fraud, and we file it before Carver knows we have the second county's records." She looked up. "Can you ride to the territorial court by Thursday?" "I can ride there by Wednesday," he said. "Then we have work to do." She did not look up from the papers again. But when his hand reached across the table to hold the document steady, while she wrote an automatic practical gesture, the kind you make without thinking when you are working alongside someone you trust. She did not move her hand away. She let him hold it steady. And she kept writing. Ronan rode to the territorial court on Wednesday and came back on Friday with a filing receipt and the particular expression of a man who has done something irreversible and is at peace with it. Mara was at the Black Ridge table when he returned. She had moved her working hours there for the week, the Henley cabin too far from the documents she needed, and neither of them pretending otherwise anymore. She had Clara on a blanket on the floor and a pen in her hand, and the Alderman cross-reference spread across the table when she heard his horse in the yard. She did not get up. She waited. He came in and set the receipt on the table in front of her without preamble. She read it. Territorial Court Fraud Filing Case Number Assigned Hearing Date Set for the second week of June. She read it twice. "They accepted the Alderman cross-reference?" she asked. The clerk read it on the spot. He went and got his supervisor. The supervisor went and got someone else. Ronan poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "I was there 4 hours. They asked me a great many questions about the documentation." "What did you tell them?" "I told them my accountant prepared it." Mara set the receipt down. "I'm not your accountant. You manage my accounts." "That is not the same thing." The clerk seemed satisfied with the description. He sat down across from her. "They want the author of the documentation available to testify if the case goes to full hearing." She had known this was coming. She had known it since she'd written the first cross-reference and understood what it would mean if it landed where it was supposed to land. She had known it, and she had done it anyway, which told her something about herself she was still processing. "Testifying in open court," she said, "in Frost Hollow." "In the territorial court, not here. But word travels. Word about me is already traveling. It's been traveling since February." She picked up her pen. "When did they set the preliminary hearing?" "June 14th. That's 7 weeks." She looked at the feed tallies she'd been working through. "Enough time to have the resurvey results in hand. If the resurvey supports what we filed, it will." "You sound certain." "I am certain. I know my land. I know where that marker sits. The resurvey is going to confirm everything you documented." He paused. "What I'm less certain about is Carver." She looked up. "He knows we filed," Ronan said. "He had someone at the court. I saw the man come out of the clerk's office 20 minutes after I went in. He knows what we filed, and he knows about the Alderman cross-reference." He set down his cup. "I don't know yet what he's going to do with that." "He's going to come at the weakest point," Mara said. "Yes. Which is me." The word sat between them plain and unashamed. She had said it because it was true, and because the only way to defend against a thing was to name it directly and stop pretending it wasn't there. Ronan looked at her. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She kept her voice even. "I am a single woman living alone with an infant in a half-repaired cabin on an empty property. I have no legal standing in this county independent of whatever arrangement I have with you. I am not on a deed. I am not on a contract. If Carver wants to remove me as a variable in this situation, there are straightforward legal mechanisms for him to do that, and there is very little you can do to prevent it, because the law in this territory does not concern itself overmuch with the welfare of women in my particular circumstance." Silence. "I know that," Ronan said. Then what do you mean when you say you're not going to let it happen? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been thinking about a solution, and I haven't said it yet because I wasn't certain how you'd receive it. Mara set down her pen. She looked at him across the table with the full, unguarded attention of a woman who has learned the hard way to pay close attention when a man is choosing his words with unusual care. Say it, she said. I want to put your name on the Black Ridge accounts, formally, as managing partner, not as an employee, not as a contractor, a partner. He held her gaze. It gives you legal standing in the county. It makes removing you from this case a great deal more complicated for Carver because your testimony would be attached to the property itself. Mara did not say anything for a long moment. That changes things, she said finally. Yes, it does. It changes what people say about us. People are already saying things about us, he said. I don't find that I care very much. I'm asking whether you care. She thought about February, about the mud her satchel had landed in, about the 14 matches and the cracked stove and the fever breaking at 3 a.m. while she sat in a chair with her daughter and cried the quiet kind of tears that don't ask anything from anyone. She thought about what it had cost her to build a life that was functional and dignified in a place that had told her she didn't deserve one. She thought about what it was worth to protect it. Draw up the paperwork, she said. The partnership agreement went to the county recorder's office on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday, Frost Hollow knew about it in the way that small frontier towns always know everything completely inaccurately and with tremendous enthusiasm. Mara was in Dora Crane's kitchen when the first version reached her, relayed by Dora with the dry efficiency of a woman who has been observing human nature long enough to find it more interesting than distressing. They're saying you've made yourself indispensable to Ronan Mercer, in ways the partnership agreement doesn't fully describe, Dora said. People can say what they like. I know. I'm telling you what they're saying so you're not surprised when it reaches you from a less friendly direction. Dora refilled her cup. Helen Alderman Pross sent word this morning. She wants you to know that 3 women in the county have come forward with documentation of Carver dealings that match your cross-reference. 2 of them lost property. 1 of them didn't, but only because her husband died before the filing was complete, and Carver apparently doesn't pursue claims against widows too much sympathy in a courtroom. Mara set down her cup. 3 more cases, she said. 3 more cases. Helen wants to know if you can meet with them before the June hearing. Tell her yes, I'll come Thursday. She was back at Black Ridge by noon. Holt met her in the yard with his arms crossed and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not alarm, but something adjacent to it, the look of a careful man who has processed information and is deciding how to deliver it. Mr. Mercer's inside, Holt said. He's got a visitor. The way he said visitor told her everything. She went inside. Silas Whitlock was sitting in the chair she used at the Black Ridge table. He was 62 years old and looked like 62 years of getting his way, broad-shouldered, white-haired, with a face that had settled into permanent authority the way some men's faces do when they've never been seriously challenged. He looked up when she came in. Ronan was standing. He had not sat down. "Mara," her father said. She had not heard his voice since February. It landed the same way it always had, like a door closing. "Papa, I heard about the partnership." He said it with the particular flatness that she recognized from childhood, the tone that meant he had already decided how he felt about something and was not interested in revising. "Then you know why I'm here," she said. She went to the table, picked up the papers she'd been working from that morning, squared them with the precision of someone who needs a moment to organize themselves without appearing to. "What is it you want to say?" "I want to say that you've handled yourself better than I expected," he said, "given the circumstances." She looked at him. "That is not an apology," she said. "It isn't." "Then it isn't enough." Silas Whitlock looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been obeyed his entire life and is encountering refusal with genuine uncertainty about how to proceed. "The Mercer arrangement," he started, "is mine," she said. "It is not yours to evaluate or negotiate or involve yourself in. I am not a Whitlock asset that became a Mercer asset. I am a person who made an agreement with another person, and it stands without your opinion of it. Mara. His voice shifted, not soft exactly, but less armored. Your mother is sick. The room changed. Mara felt it the way the air pressure alters when a real thing enters a conversation full of maneuvering. She looked at her father, and she looked at his face, and she saw beneath the authority and the flatness something she had not seen there in a very long time. He was frightened. How sick, she said. The doctor was there last week. He says it's her lungs. He says... He stopped. Silas Whitlock, who had never in Mara's memory left a sentence unfinished, stopped. He says she may not see the summer. Clara made a sound from the blanket on the floor, a small, cheerful sound, the sound of a 6-month-old who has discovered her own foot and found it remarkable. All three adults looked at her. Mara spoke first. I'll come and see her, she said. Not for you, for her. She looked at her father steadily. And you will not use that visit to talk about the partnership or the court case or any arrangement involving this property or Ronan Mercer. Do you understand me? Her father looked at her for a long time. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name, not shame, not quite. Something older and less practiced than shame. I understand, he said. He left without addressing Ronan directly. Ronan held the door and said nothing and closed it after him, and then he stood at the window until the sound of horses faded. I'm sorry, he said. About your mother. So am I. Mara sat down. She picked up her pen. Her hand was entirely steady, which surprised her. The June filing still needs the supporting affidavits from Helen's 3 witnesses. I want to go over the format with you before I meet with them Thursday. Mara. I'm fine, she said. I know you are. I'm not questioning it. He came and sat across from her, not at a working distance, but at the closer distance that had become their natural one. Over the past weeks, the distance at which two people operate when they have stopped pretending they are merely colleagues. I just want you to know that you don't have to be fine every minute. She looked at him. If I stop being fine, she said carefully, I'll let you know. He held her gaze. All right. Now, the affidavits. She visited her mother on a Wednesday. Ruth Whitlock was smaller than she remembered, diminished in the way illness diminishes people, not in character, but in physical presence, as if the body were withdrawing its investment from the visible world. She was in the bed in the room that faced east, the room she had always said got the best morning light, and she was awake when Mara came in. Mara sat in the chair beside the bed. Clara was in the sling, and Ruth's eyes went to the baby immediately with the look of a woman seeing something she has wanted to see for a long time. She's beautiful, Ruth said. She looks like you, Mara said. Around the eyes. Ruth reached out. Mara leaned forward and let her touch Clara's cheek, the baby blinking, and then settling into the interest of a creature investigating something new. I should have come, Ruth said. In February. I should have... She stopped. Mama. Mara's voice was quiet. Don't. I stood at the window. I know. I was afraid of him. Ruth looked at her daughter. That is not an excuse. I know it isn't an excuse. I'm telling you because I want you to know it wasn't. It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was that I didn't know how to want the right thing, louder than I was afraid. Mara looked at her mother's face. She thought about February. About the curtain that hadn't moved. She had carried that curtain with her for months, the image of it, the weight of it. She had built an entire winter around the fact of that curtain not moving. I know, she said. And she meant it differently than she would have meant it in February. They did not talk about Silas. They did not talk about the partnership or Ronan or the court case. They talked about Clara, her opinions, her habits, the way she had grabbed Ronan's finger that first time and held on. Ruth laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that costs something when your lungs are compromised, and that you spend anyway because some things are worth the cost. When Mara left, Ruth held her hand for a moment at the door. You built something, Ruth said. I heard about the cabin, the roof, the accounts, what you found in those documents." She looked at her daughter with an expression that was not quite pride. It was beyond pride, something more fundamental. Recognition. "You built something real." "Yes," Mara said. "I did." The June hearing came on a Thursday, clear and warm, and Mara rode to the territorial court in a dress she had borrowed from Helen Alderman Pross, because it was the kind of room where appearance communicated position, and she was not going to give anyone anything free to work with. Clara stayed with Dora Crane. Ronan rode beside her, and neither of them talked much on the way, which was comfortable, rather than strained the silence of two people who have run out of things to say that aren't the most important thing. There were 9 people in the courtroom who had not come because of Black Ridge. 3 of them were Helen's witnesses. The other 6 were ranchers and landowners from 2 counties over who had heard through the particular underground of frontier communities that someone had finally documented what Denton Carver did and how he did it. Carver was there. He sat at the opposite table with 2 lawyers and the louder man from the yard who looked at Mara when she came in and then looked away. The judge called the hearing to order. Mara was sworn in, and she testified for 40 minutes. She said exactly what she had documented in exactly the order she had documented it, in the clear, precise voice she used for numbers and facts. The voice that left no room for misreading. When Carver's lawyer tried to suggest her interest in the outcome compromised her testimony, she laid the partnership agreement on the record and explained in calm and detailed terms that her interest in the outcome was a matter of legal record and entirely consistent with the duty of a managing partner to defend property rights. The lawyer did not ask a follow-up question. Helen's 3 witnesses testified after her. Then the ranchers from the other counties, 2 of whom had documentation of their own that matched Mara's cross-reference with a precision that left the room very quiet. Carver's lawyers spoke for 20 minutes. The judge called a recess. He came back in 45 minutes. He ruled for Black Ridge on the survey dispute. He referred the fraud claim to the territorial prosecutor's office. He ordered the return of the 2 properties taken through fraudulent survey claims in the adjacent county. He noted for the record that the documentation presented was among the most thorough he had seen in a land dispute case in 15 years on the bench. He did not look at Carver when he said it. He looked at Mara. Outside the courthouse in the June sun, Ronan stood beside her while the other ranchers shook hands and exchanged words, and Helen Alderman Pross accepted congratulations with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting 2 years for a specific thing and is allowing herself to feel it fully now that it has arrived. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe I owe you a debt I don't know how to calculate." "You don't owe me anything," Mara said. "You brought me timber in February." "Mara, that is not—" "And a hammer," she said. "And nails. And salt pork when I didn't ask for it. And you rode 4 miles in February because there was smoke from my chimney and you thought someone might need checking on." She looked at him. "We can call it even." He looked back at her. "We are not even," he said. "Not close." "Then you can work on it," she said. "We have time." She meant it practically. She meant it in the way of a woman who has learned to say true things plainly because the alternative is too expensive. But she also meant it in the other way, the way she had not yet let herself say out loud, and she thought from the quality of his silence and the particular steadiness of how he looked at her in the June sun outside the courthouse that he understood both meanings. Holt was waiting with the horses. He looked at their faces and at the courthouse door and arrived at his conclusions without asking for clarification. "Well," he said. "Well." Ronan agreed. Mara untied her horse. She looked back at Frost Hollow at the town that had made up its mind about her in February and had been slowly revising ever since the way truth always eventually revises a conclusion drawn too fast. She looked at the clerk's office, where the partnership agreement was filed. Her name on a legal document in this county for the first time permanent and witnessed and real. She mounted up. "I need to get back to Clara," she said. "And you have 63 head of cattle that need their summer count done before the end of the week." 64, Ronan said. "We had a late calf this morning." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me." I'm telling you now. Update the ledger when you get home." She turned her horse toward the road. "And congratulations on your 64th head, Mr. Mercer." She heard him behind her, the sound of him mounting, and then the sound of his horse moving up alongside hers at the easy, companionable pace that two horses settle into when they have been making the same journey together long enough to know the rhythm of it. She did not tell him to ride ahead. He did not offer to. They rode home together through the June afternoon, and Frost Hollow watched them go, and Mara Whitlock did not look back. Ruth Whitlock died on a Tuesday in late July, in the room that faced east in the morning light she had always said was the best light. Mara was there. She had been there 3 days, sleeping in the chair beside the bed, the way she had once slept in the chair beside Clara's blanket nest during the fever, with one ear always partially awake and listening. She had not been asked to come. She had simply appeared at the Whitlock Ranch on a Saturday morning with Clara on her hip and her working bag over her shoulder. And Silas had opened the door and looked at her for a long moment and stepped aside without a word, which was the closest thing to an invitation she was going to get, and she knew it. Ruth had been awake that first day. Weak, but present, the particular presence of a person who knows they have a limited number of conversations left and is choosing carefully how to spend them. She had held Clara for 20 minutes, the baby sitting upright on the bed with Ruth's hands curved around her small waist, and the two of them had regarded each other with the mutual seriousness of very old and very young creatures who share some understanding the middle-aged cannot access. "She has your stubbornness," Ruth said. "She has yours," Mara said. "Mine is louder. Yours is the kind that waits." Ruth had smiled at that. It was the last real smile Mara saw from her. By Monday, Ruth was sleeping more than she was awake. By Tuesday morning, she was breathing in a way that told Mara what the next hours would hold. Silas sat on the other side of the bed, his big rancher's hands folded in his lap, looking at his wife with an expression that Mara had never seen on her father's face in 30 years of living under his roof. He looked undone, not broken. Silas Whitlock was too constructed a man to break simply, but undone the way a structure looks when the thing holding it together has been quietly fundamental all along, and you only understand that when it's gone. Ruth went quietly. The breathing changed, and then it stopped, and the room was very still. Silas put his hand over Ruth's. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said very quietly, "She was proud of you." Mara looked at her father across the bed. "I know," she said. "She told me. Before she got too sick to argue with me effectively." A pause. "She said I had confused consequence with character, that what you did, how you handled what happened, was character, and that I had missed it because I was too busy being humiliated to look." The room was quiet, except for Clara, who had fallen asleep in the travel basket Mara had set in the corner, breathing the small, even breaths of a child, entirely at peace with the world. "She was right," Mara said. "Yes." Silas looked at his wife's face. "She generally was." He did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer it automatically. They sat on either side of Ruth Whitlock, and they let the morning pass in the particular silence of two people who have a great deal of ground to cover and have just agreed without saying so to begin. The funeral was small. Ruth had not wanted ceremony. She had said so clearly enough in her last lucid week that even Silas did not attempt to override it. A handful of neighbors, Dora Crane, Helen Alderman Pross, the minister from the Frost Hollow Church. Ronan came. He stood at the back and did not intrude, and afterward he shook Silas Whitlock's hand with the direct simplicity of a man who has decided the most respectful thing he can offer is presence without complication. Silas shook his hand and held it for a moment. "You've looked after my daughter," he said. "Your daughter," Ronan said, "looks after herself. I've been trying to keep up." Silas looked at him, then he looked at Mara. Then he made the sound of a man recalibrating. "Come to the ranch," he said to Ronan. "Next week. There's something I want to discuss." Ronan glanced at Mara. "Whatever you want to discuss with Mr. Mercer," Mara said to her father, "you can discuss with me in the room." Silas looked like a man who wanted to object and had lost the standing to do it. Fine, he said. Next week, both of you. She did not know what to expect from that meeting. She spent the days between the funeral and the appointment running through possibilities, her father wanting to formalize, something wanting to extract something, wanting to position himself adjacent to the Black Ridge success in a way that served the Whitlock name. She knew his patterns. She had grown up inside them. What she did not expect was what he actually said. They sat at the Whitlock kitchen table, the same table she had sat at every morning for the first 18 years of her life, and Silas put a document on the table between them and said, "This is the deed to the East 40 acres, the creek-fed parcel, the one that borders the Mercer property at the north corner." Mara looked at the deed. She did not touch it. "What about it?" she said. "I want to sign it over to you." He said it the way he said everything, direct, no preamble. "Not to Mercer, to you. Your name, your deed, independent of any arrangement you have with him or anyone else." Silence. "Why?" she said. "Because your mother was right that I confused consequence with character. And because you have earned 40 acres by surviving a winter I put you in." He looked at the deed, not at her. "And because I am 62 years old, and I do not have the time left to fix this the slow way, so I am doing the direct thing instead." Mara looked at her father. She thought about the mud, the satchel, the 14 matches, the cracked stove. She thought about Clara's fever and the willow bark, and Dora Crane's kitchen, and 4 miles of frozen road in the dark. She thought about every morning she had gotten up in the Henley cabin and done the next necessary thing without anyone watching and without anyone's permission. She thought about what 40 acres with creek access meant for a woman with a child and a partnership on a working ranch. She picked up the deed. "I'll have it reviewed," she said. "Of course you will," Silas said, and something in his voice that might in a different man have been called wry. She had Ronan look at it that evening. He read it twice. "It's clean," he said. "No conditions, no reversions, no covenants that complicate your standing. It's straightforward." "That surprises you." "It surprises me a little," he said. "Yes, it surprises me too." She took the deed back. "But my mother was a persuasive woman, even from a sickbed." She folded the deed into her working bag with the precision she gave to all important documents. "The creek boundary is going to need to be surveyed properly. I don't want any ambiguity about where the Whitlock land ends and the Mercer land begins." "You want a clean line," Ronan said. "I always want a clean line." She looked at him. "It's how I work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mara, can I ask you something that isn't about the land?" She looked up. "You can ask," she said. "I reserve the right to redirect to the land if the question is poorly constructed." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's not poorly constructed." He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, the posture she had come to recognize as the one he adopted when he was saying something he had been working up to for a while. "When I rode into your clearing in February, when you told me this was private property and you didn't need checking on, were you afraid?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "Yes," she said. "Of me. Of needing you." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." He was quiet. "Being afraid of needing someone," she said, "is different from being afraid of them. I knew you weren't a threat in the first 5 minutes. What I was afraid of was what it meant if I let myself rely on anyone, because I had just finished learning the cost of that. Your father, my father, and other people who decided my value was conditional." She paused. "What I had in the Henley cabin was mine. It was hard and it was cold and it was barely enough, but it was mine. I was afraid that if I let someone help, it would become theirs instead." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "Has it?" he said. "Become mine?" "No," she said immediately. "It's become ours, which is different. Ours means both names on the work and both voices in the decisions, and neither one of us disappearing into the arrangement." He reached across the table. "Not for the deed. Not for a document." He put his hand over hers the way he had held the paper steady that first night she'd worked at his table, the automatic gesture of a man who helps without making a production of it. "I'd like to make it formally ours," he said. "All of it. The ranch, the accounts, Clara." He paused. "I have not been good at saying things like this. I'm better with practical gestures." "I know," she said. "I've noticed. But I'm saying it now because you have earned the right to hear it plainly, and I have spent 7 months being indirect about it, and I think that's long enough." She looked at his hand over hers. She thought about the kind of woman she had been before February, competent, steady, waiting for the right circumstances to come together in the right order. She thought about the kind of woman she was, now the one who had built a roof and reconstructed a ledger and walked into a territorial courtroom and said exactly what she knew, in exactly the words that mattered. She thought about Clara, who was 7 months old and had opinions about everything, and grabbed what interested her with both hands and held on. "The ranch already runs better with both of us in it," she said. "It does," he agreed. "And Clara thinks you're a permanent fixture." "I'm aware. She told me with considerable clarity last week by refusing to let go of my hat." "She has opinions about hats. She has opinions about everything." "Yes," Mara said. "She gets that from me." She turned her hand over under his so that they were holding properly, not one covering the other, but both equal. "Ask me plainly," she said, "since you said you were going to." He looked at her across the table, this man who had ridden 4 miles in February with timber. He didn't need to leave, who had held documents steady without being asked who had said. "I know," in the quiet voice of someone who meant it, who had looked at her from the beginning, not with pity or judgment, but with the simple, steady recognition of a person seeing another person clearly. "Mara Whitlock," he said, "will you marry me?" He did not say it like a question. He said it like a thing he had already decided was true and was asking her to confirm. She understood that. She had her own version of that certainty. She had been carrying it since the courthouse steps in June, and possibly since before that, since the night she had ridden home in the dark, thinking about the way he had said her name. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married on the Saturday in December at Blackridge in the front room of the house that Mara had reorganized twice since she started working there, and that felt by now more familiar to her than any room in the Whitlock Ranch had ever felt. The minister from Frost Hollow came. Dora Crane came and held Clara for the duration with the expression of a woman who has waited a long time for something like this and is not going to pretend she isn't pleased. Helen Alderman Pross came with her husband, who shook Ronan's hand and then shook Mara's with equal weight, which she noted. Holt stood at the back in his good coat with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who considers this outcome both correct and overdue. Silas Whitlock came. He stood in the back of the room beside Holt, and he did not speak much, and when the minister pronounced them married, and Ronan turned to Mara with the specific expression of a man who has gotten the thing he intended to get and is not taking it lightly, Silas Whitlock looked at his daughter and he nodded. Once. The kind of nod that carries everything a man like him cannot say aloud. She looked back at him. She nodded once in return. That was enough. It was not forgiveness entire. Not yet. Forgiveness took time, and they had only begun the slow work of it. But it was a beginning, and beginnings were things Mara Whitlock understood better than most. Clara, at 7 months, managed the ceremony with her characteristic focus, sitting upright in Dora's arms, and observing the proceedings with the gravity of a small person conducting a thorough evaluation. When Ronan reached over after the minister finished and put his hand on Clara's head, the baby grabbed his finger in her fist and held on, and Dora Crane made a sound that was not quite a sob, but was clearly its close neighbor. After, when the guests had eaten and the room had softened into the easy noise of people who are comfortable with each other, Mara stood at the window with Clara on her hip, her standard position, the one she could maintain indefinitely, the one that had started in the Henley cabin in February, with a 6-week-old and 14 matches and a cracked stove and a winter that wanted them both dead. Ronan came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the East 40 acres," she said. The creek boundary survey needs to happen before the ground freezes hard. I want it done before we lose another 2 weeks to weather. He looked at her. Mara, it's your wedding day. I'm aware. The ground doesn't know that. She looked at him. I'm also thinking that this is the first time in 11 months that I've been in a room full of people who all know exactly what I am, and not one of them is sorry for me. He was quiet. I'm thinking, she said more quietly, that I built something, and it held. Ronan looked at her, at Clara, at the room full of people who had come to witness something that had started in a clearing in February, and arrived here by way of frozen roads, and cracked ledgers, and a territorial courthouse, and 40 acres with creek access, and one man who kept showing up until she believed he was going to keep showing up. It held, he said. Outside December settled over Black Ridge, the way December did, cold clear. The kind of night where the stars came out so sharp you could believe each one had been placed deliberately. Clara had fallen asleep against Mara's shoulder, heavy and warm, and trusting in the absolute way of a child who has never known a night her mother wasn't there. Mara Whitlock. Mara Mercer. Now, though she intended to keep both names on the accounts because precision mattered, and she was precise, stood in the home she had built her way into through competence and stubbornness and the refusal to disappear, and she felt the particular solidity of a life that is yours, because you made it, not because anyone handed it to you. She had been cast out in February with nothing but a child and her own 2 hands. She had built the rest herself, and every door that had ever been closed against her had led her step by necessary step to the one she had just walked through, the one that opened from the inside on her terms in her own time and stayed open. Not because she had been rescued, because she had refused to be anything other than exactly who she was until the world learned to make room for her.